Welcome to Always Listening. We're your hosts. I'm Joel.
I'm Jay, and I'm not in Winterfell anymore.
I'm not either. Although, you know what just occurred to me, like literally yesterday or 2 days ago, Jay? So this week marks my 7th year as a podcaster. 7 years ago this week. As a matter of fact, I think the 13th was when we released the first episode. So yesterday as we were recording this. But I've been a podcaster as long as Game of Thrones has been running. Like we're pretty congruent. Those two things happened right alongside each other. And I didn't really think about that at the time, but it did. I lasted about as long as Khaleesi did. Interesting stuff. We're not going to talk about Game of Thrones this week. We might, depending upon what they do next Sunday. You and I might talk about it a little bit next week, postscript like we did for Endgame, just because it is a big cultural moment.
Well, they've made a lot of interesting content choices, and
they have.
I don't want to give too much of a spoiler away. This might be a little spoilery if you haven't watched. Fast forward like a minute, but they told us what they were going to do the entire way, and I was watching, going, "Well, they're not going to do that," and then they did it, and it was. It's one of those things where it's like, "There's no way they're gonna do that," and then they did it, and you're like, well, they told me, so I shouldn't have been surprised, but I'm like, what the heck?
It was a little bit like what's the movie from not Christian Bale, The Prestige. It's Christian Bale and Hugh Jackman. You know, the beginning of the movie, it says watch closely. And then there's a trick, you know, and he tells you exactly at the beginning of the movie what he's going to do for you, and then he does it anyway. I think there is something. Well, we'll talk about that next week, maybe. Let's talk about this. Let's talk about podcasting this week, Jay, and focus on the business of podcasting. We hinted at it last episode. There was a new company in play, making a few waves called Podfund. And they say they're going to give you up to $50,000 to help you grow your show. The pitch is that they are running podcasts like startup businesses. They come and they say, you know, just like on Shark Tank, you go, here's my idea. I want $50,000 for 10% of the business, et cetera, whatever. The Podfund team has raised $2.3 million in its seed round, which will go toward investing in creators that they think have the chops to build a successful podcasting business. $2.3 million, if you had brought this article out a year ago, would have been much more impressive than bringing it out now, I think. That doesn't seem like a whole lot of investment when we know companies like Luminary have, you know, $100 million to throw around, and companies like Spotify still have, I think they've got another 150 or 200 million left that they say they're going to spend still.
Well, this is by the Radio Public folks. All right. The same people that brought you Radio Public are bringing you Podfund. And it's geared for, I want to say smaller podcasters, but it's not really smaller. It's the medium-sized podcasters. This is something that back in the day when I was working at Blog Talk Radio before it merged with Spreaker to become Voxnest, my boss, Andy Toe, used to talk about the middle class. He's like, we're not necessarily looking for the higher reach podcasters. Obviously, if we talked to them and they were interested in what we were talking about, we were going to bring them on. That's obvious. And we weren't necessarily looking at the lower class, but we weren't turning the lower class away either. There's always a diamond in the rough that you can find, and oftentimes you have to build a very large, and I'm using lower class. I'm not meaning that in a derogatory way, just in a described like size of audience type thing here. And you need a large amount of them to find those diamonds. But then there's a middle class, and there has to be a middle class. And ultimately, what we did find in the 4 years that we did this is that middle class really doesn't exist, Joel. It doesn't exist. Or at least where we think the middle class isn't where the middle class exists. You're either a very large podcaster or you're a low podcaster. And I'll bring it back to Libsyn, who releases their stats, and they just released the stats this past week about where the median is. And the median number is 175. If you get 175 listens to your podcast, 50% get less and 50% get more. So technically, 175 is the middle class. That is very telling to me, because remember, the number that advertisers are interested in, at the very least, is 10,000. So where are those shows? They don't exist, Joel, or very few of them do. And if you do have that 10,000, you usually you're getting way more than 10,000. And if you're getting way more, you've already been approached, or you already have a deal with somebody that's out there that's monetizing your shows for you. So the question is, how do you take that middle class at 175 and grow it to 10,000? That's the $1 million question that if anybody has the answer to, you're going to become the savior of podcasting.
Is that even possible? Like, so one of the things
possible.
that we talk about a lot, one of the things that we're going to talk about in a little while, Jay, is like growing the overall listenership, and whether some of these new initiatives and new apps are actually growing listenership, or whether they're just cannibalizing the current listenership of podcasting. We see the chart every year, or we've seen it so far from the folks over there that are what's your buddy that does the reports?
Edison Research, Tom
Yeah,
Webster.
Edison Research. They're gonna
bromance.
They're gonna shut off our podcast consumer next year. We're not gonna get the great report that we got this year.
No. We're still gonna get it. We're just not gonna get. We won't get it on a quarterly basis like people who pay for it will. We're still getting a podcast consumer once a year, but
Really?
there'll be less. Yeah, there's going to be less content that we've been like that share of ear, specifically that type of content that's behind a paywall now. So we're not going to get how much of the day does a podcast consumer spend listening to podcasts versus radio or whatever. That stuff is behind a paywall, but we'll still get a yearly report on the state of podcasting.
That's very interesting to me. Edison did not make that clear, I don't think, in their language. But my point was this: that graph is growing, but it's growing slowly, and we think that's going to continue to grow like at a steady rate as people discover the medium and as the technology barriers lower. My question is, you say, okay, we're going to take those shows that have 175 listeners an episode and grow those up to 10,000. Some of those, I think it's possible. You have a creator who is pouring their heart and soul into a show, and the show is great, but it takes them so long to do it that they can't put it out consistently. Well, if you put a little bit of production help behind them, they could put it out consistently and grow their audience faster that way. Okay, great. There's an answer there. Maybe there's somebody that has a great raw idea, but they've got no journalistic background, no theatrical background, no storytelling background, et cetera, et cetera. So if you brought in an editor or a storytelling mentor, they could really explode with creativity and grow their audience exponentially. Okay, that makes sense. But the vast majority of shows, let's be honest, are, as Dave Jackson says it, two guys, one brain, right? Sharon, it's two buddies just getting it out. And to me, I think about 175 people an episode is all you should ever expect to have for that, because it's literally like your buddies in a bar. Everybody gets together and we share a brewski and enjoy our evening. And there's nothing wrong with that. That is a beautiful thing that podcasting brings us. But I do wonder if even initiatives like this, if we pitch it as you've just laid it out, which was a very pretty picture, but like, is that giving the vast majority of those lower classes, let's don't call them that, let's call them hobbyists, right? Those hobbyist podcasters that are hovering around that 150, 175 per episode download mark, are we giving them false hope that there is any future for them to make this an actual growing initiative or enterprise as opposed to just a hobby? There's nothing wrong with being a fisher, a fisherman, right? On Saturdays and Sundays, you don't have to become a pro angler.
Well, it's that. See, you've worn a T-shirt, for those who are listening to the podcast, which is all of you. Joel is wearing a T-shirt that says "Y'all need Jesus," and so every time I look at him on our Skype video, I keep bringing up Jesus metaphors. But podcasting needs to have that come to Jesus moment and understand the realities of what they're doing. The two guys with one brain show is only going to get so far. What are you going to do to make that content exceptional, going to make great content? And we're going to talk about this even a little bit later on. When it comes to content, everybody thinks that their content is great. We put out great content. My content's fantastic. It's phenomenal. But is it really great? Like, with a fine-tooth comb, if you sat and listened to it, you couldn't nitpick anything out of it. Because if you can nitpick even just one item out of it, your content, I hate to tell you, is not great. It might be very good, but it's not great. I often talk about the 3 E's in podcasting. It has to educate, has to entertain, and it has to be emotional. You have to have all 3 of those things to have great content. Now, you can have very good content that doesn't have all 3 of the E's, and it could still perform extremely well, but it's only very good. It's not great. I think the definition of great really needs to highlight just how great your content really is.
Well, we started the episode talking about Game of Thrones, right? Which is in a culture which is so fractured, we basically don't share anything together. Like, even the Super Bowl isn't really for everyone anymore, like it was once upon a time. There's no
it's
network
the Patriots
TV.
Invitational.
There's no network TV that brings us the MASH finale that literally all of America watches. We just don't have those moments anymore. Endgame is one, actually, Marvel's Avengers Endgame is one that it feels like literally everyone was there for. Game of Thrones is sort of like that too. You have the few people who aren't watching Game of Thrones and who aren't into it at some level are so specifically opposed to it. They're part of the conversation as well. They're like, no, we're right here with you, and we still don't watch it. I never will watch it. And some
I'm
of them
surprised too by the people that I see that don't watch Game of Thrones. Like, you see the ratings for it.
Well,
I'm like,
so complex.
What, you don't watch it? My brain doesn't even wrap around that.
I do understand it, because the storytelling along these 7 seasons has been very thick, and I think a lot of people want their entertainment to be more lean back. And Bill Simmons talks about it all the time, right? He can't keep the names straight on Game of Thrones. He doesn't know. He goes, "Oh, it's the Dragon Lady, and it's the it's the Dwarf guy, and it's the Wolf Boy, and whatever." And like, he doesn't know who they are, and that's fine. He's enjoying it on a different level. Some of us really like the minutia, but my point is, even a show like that, even a show that literally has the entire culture talking about it simultaneously, which is so rare these days, this season has really divided the fan base, and I think overall will go down in the record books as one that was sort of a disappointment, no matter how they stick the final episode. And that's just because points along the way have risen so high. They've put the bar so high for themselves because they did all of those E's.
Took 2 years off.
Yeah, well, and
they raised the bar that high, took 2 years off, so everyone expected them to reach the bar.
Something even more. Yeah,
quite
we
honestly,
were basically promised 6 Avengers Endgames, right? We were told we were going to get like 6 movies to finish this thing off, and it didn't really quite work out that way. And also, no one can be fully satisfied with where the story goes, right? Because we all have our own headcanon on how this was all going to end up and who we wanted to win, et cetera, et cetera. So, but my point there is, you're never going to please everyone. And even a super successful team who has risen to those heights will then stumble to reach them again. That was my point, as far as like, how we raised the bar, yes, but then also we have to understand that by raising the bar, like, you're going to end up shooting yourself in the foot at some point because you've raised the bar too. You can't jump it again, Anyway.
And what does this all have to do with Podfund? It's that not only are they not going to deal with shows that are in that medium, that 175, they're looking for shows that have proven success. So you can't even be a startup. You can't be somebody that doesn't have a show and be like, well, I'm going to start this podcast. And no, they want a show that already has proven success. You've shown growth. You need this money to bring you to the next level. Basically, they're looking for that show. I'll just use a random number. I have no idea. This is not an actual quote. I've not spoken to the folks at Podfund, at least in regards to Podfund. They're looking for a show that's at that 5,000 mark, let's say, and they're looking to get to that 10,000, they need this money. This money is going to help them double the size of their audience and get to that number that's going to help them be in that upper echelon where they'll be able to get bigger advertisers. And ultimately, in taking that money, they're going to share in any revenues moving forward that will pay back the investor. Now, you also have to understand, and I understand this from watching Shark Tank all the time, is the investor is only going to give you the money if they think they can get the money back plus some. They're not just going to hand you $50,000 out of the kindness of their heart. And if they do give you $50,000, they're going to have to get that money back. So if you decide, you know what, I'm not going to make it to my goal, I've had enough, I'm quitting, you're still going to have to pay that $50,000 back. So if you've taken all that money and you've invested it in, say, marketing, which I think is where a large chunk of that money should be spent, and you don't reach the number that you're looking for and you decide you're going to call it quits, you better hope that you've got a bank account or a good attorney to help you pay back the $50,000 that you just took out as essentially a loan. That's basically how this whole thing is going to end up working out. And I think in that manner, you're going to have a lot of failures. I hope Podfund is ready for the amount of failures they're going to run into in this. And maybe that's why they only have $2.5 million and not $200 million.
Very, very well said. Yeah. I don't always agree with Todd Cochran, but he made a post or a comment on Podfund's story in one of the Facebook groups and said, you want to stay up sleepless nights, bring on investors. That's a good way to give yourself a hernia or an ulcer. Folks, let's move on to something that is more, I think, effective, more actually impactful for podcasting at large, and that's IAB certification. The article that we're looking at is from Inside Radio. Growing momentum for IAB certification. Art19 and Voxnest are the latest to join the certified list. Of course, Blueberry was the first one to finish the certification process. Lots of companies are IAB compliant, and you're going to give us a breakdown in just a second, Jay, on what the difference there is. Tons of companies are IAB compliant, but the certification process, yes, they claim to be IAB compliant, but the certification process means that IAB has gone in, tested, verified their processes, and then actually put the stamp on it that say, we agree with the numbers that are coming from this company.
Yeah. So the IAB is a group that was formed essentially to deal with major media, but definitely saw the rise in podcasting and created a podcasting division. Pretty much anyone that's anyone. I believe there's 25 companies that have representatives from the podcasting industry. Obviously, Blueberry, Libsyn, Voxnest are all part of that. Have representatives that are part of the IAB. Now, these people got together and they've formed different committees to discuss some of the things that need to happen in podcasting. Obviously, the biggest one is metrics, and that is essentially what the IAB deals with in terms of advertising, is advertising metrics and how do we deliver that. They created IAB metrics version 1, which was sort of the compromise of because all 25 companies were counting their numbers differently. We talked about the Magic Pizza Shop a couple of episodes ago. Everyone had their different way of counting. The first version was a compromise of all 25 of those companies and exactly how to go about counting. That was effective to a point. They decided that it needed to become more effective, and then they released version 2, which became an even more stringent way of counting actual metrics in regards to how to then take them and sell them to advertisers. IAB version 2, I believe right now, is the most current version that's available. And in that time period, almost every one of the companies claimed that they were IAB version 2 compliant. Well, the thing is, if you read IAB version 2, it's very nebulous. There are some nebulous regions about what certain things might mean and how you can go about counting those things in regards to the numbers that you present to your consumers. And because of that, there are still instances where you could be on one platform and you could get a certain set of numbers and transfer to another hosting platform and get a completely different set of numbers, even though they claim they are IAB version 2 compliant, and that's because the rules weren't that stringent. What certification is now doing is certification is setting up an independent third party to go in and audit your process. From this third party will come in and be like, all right, show us how you're doing it. Give us the nuts and bolts. And, oh, this is wrong. You can't be doing this anymore. You got to take this out. Oh, this is perfect. This is, you can continue doing this. Oh, this is, and they'll go in and they will completely certify. And once you get that certification, that means your numbers are 100% compliant. And I hate the fact that it's the same word, but it means that your numbers are now 100% compliant with the means and measures of the IAB, exactly the way that your numbers should be counted as put forth by the IAB. Now, where does that cause a problem? Todd has mentioned this a number of times, especially since it was basically just Todd at Blueberry and NPR who were certified previous to these new three. You didn't mention Wooshka. Wooshka, there's a bunch of companies, and we're going to get into that too. For some reason, when the news first came out, everyone was talking about Art19, but nobody mentioned that Voxnest and Wooshka were also certified. And then on Monday, Voxnest and Wooshka got a little bit more pub, but then Voxnest was the only other one that really got pushed, and Art19 was repeated. And I wonder why everyone was talking about Art19 and not the other two. It's a little strange. I wonder if that has to do with the publicity or the PR companies behind that are working with those particular companies. But in any case, there are still companies out there that will claim that they are IAB version 2 compliant, but that does not mean that they're certified, and their compliancy doesn't necessarily match with that of a certified company's numbers. And the reason why it's important is because when you're in a conversation with potential advertisers and you say that your numbers are certified, they mean more. The advertising companies right now are saying, well, no, this company says that they're compliant, so they're just as good as your certified numbers, that you have to pay. By the way, it's not a small bill that you have to pay to become certified. And Todd is like pulling it. He doesn't have a lot of hair on his head anyway. He'd be the first to admit that, so I'm not saying anything derogatory again. But he's pulling even more hair out of his head because he's going in talking with these advertisers who are still believing these other numbers from these other platforms, and those numbers happen to be larger than what the certified numbers are. And those companies probably will never pay that bill to become certified because they don't need to at this particular point in time. So as more and more companies become certified, there'll be two things that will be happening. One, the numbers will be more trustworthy amongst everyone. Two, the numbers are all going to be the same or should be fairly similar. Like we're talking maybe that 1% to 2%, you know, when you get a poll and they say there's a 1% to 2% disagreement, it's going to be a much smaller, it's not going to be a 10% difference or a 20% difference. Yes. It's only going to be a 1% to 2% difference between companies.
Statistical anomalies. That's
right.
That's exactly what they mean when they say that. To me, I think Libsyn is the one big, leftover here. And we know that they've been in the compliance testing.
They are currently going, right. Yeah, they're currently going through the certification. But they were in at the same time as these other three, which can only tell you one thing, and that's they have a lot more work to do to reach the certification. They have a lot more changes that they have to make to their current accounting system.
Is it as simple as well, no, I mean, that's not, I started to say, is it as simple as the fact that they've been in it longer maybe than some of these others? So like Wooshka, for instance, is a fairly new company. Art19 has only been around a handful of years. Is it the fact that when they came in, there were already sort of the 1.0 standards in place, and so they didn't have a lot of cruft from older systems to overcome or rebuild, et cetera, whereas Libsyn's been in the game so long, they've been doing this a lot of different ways, and it's like we can't shut the system down while we build the new one. We just have to rebuild it in place, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, is that part of the deal? I don't know. I'm trying to give them an out.
Blueberry's been in it just as long.
So, I mean, the argument there, I suppose, would be that they're more nimble because it's basically a one-man company, and Todd can do whatever he wants to do, you know?
Perhaps. I'm not, I can't, anything that I say would be conjecture, and it wouldn't be fair to any company.
Very good. I was trying to put you on the spot there, honestly.
To say anything about the conjecture. But the one thing I will say is that the one conjecture that I will say is that the certified numbers will most likely lead to smaller numbers for people, and that they shouldn't be looking to, oh, well, my numbers changed, I've been lied to, I got to jump ship to another company because I need bigger numbers. No, your audience is still the exact same as it's always been. You're just now getting a truer reflection of what the numbers should have been all along. The only reason why they were different is because of different accounting methods, different ways to count the Magic Pizza Shop visitors.
So my thoughts on how this is going to roll out is Libsyn has to do it. If they don't do it, they will bleed a lot of the big names to these other companies that are IAB certified or that have finished the process for 2.0. And so once they finish the certification process and are able to do it publicly, to me, if you look, you've got Voxnest there, you've got NPR, you've got Blueberry, and you've got Libsyn. That basically takes enough of the market over to that side. There may be a handful of small players that try to differentiate themselves through pricing or design or something like that don't bother getting the certification, but it won't matter to the podcast industry as a whole because the vast majority of podcasters will be served by one of these companies that is. That's the way that I feel about it.
There are there's another list of companies that are currently going through the certification process or have said that they are also going through the certification process, like Simplecast. I believe Podcast One was also going through the certification process at the same time as these companies. That's, by the way, if you're listening to the New Media Show and you're listening to this show and you're wondering what company they were referring to, it's Podcast One. I have no problem saying it's Podcast One. Podcast One has notoriously, I mean, there's been stories about it all the time where Norm Pattis has pulled out a gun on his accounter and said, make sure the numbers say what they need to say. That's been written in plenty of publications. Whether or not the story is true or not, it has been reported. We can cite a source. So that's all I'm going to say about that. Podcast One is definitely the company that Todd and Rob were discussing in the New Media Show this past week. Moving forward, there are other companies that are going through this. They just haven't finished the certification process. And I can tell you it takes a long time. Todd said that they started in January. I know that at least the application to become certified had started at Voxnest at around the same time that I was let go. So it's been over 8 months and they finally got the certificate. So it takes a while for this to actually go forth and actually become a IAB certified company.
Well, and I mean, I imagine it's still not I want to use the word evolving. I don't mean that. I don't mean that the standard is evolving, but I mean, this is the first time that this process has been finalized. These are the first round of companies still that are reaching this certification process. I think the fact that it's taking a while should be understood. But again, I think long-term, this next round of companies that come in will effectively give us the rest of the podcast industry as a whole will be covered. And the little bit of, folks on the edge that might stay as sort of outlaws in the wild, wild west, I don't think it's going to matter. I think the IAB certification will be the standard. And eventually we might get a 3.0 spec down the road, to make it more refined. But again, I think everybody will do that basically at the same time. I think the industry will walk in lockstep from here on out. Jay, tell me a little bit about what's going on with Google Podcasts. The we talked a couple of weeks ago, or I think maybe in the last episode actually, about how Apple has rolled out the Apple Podcasts web links now. And when you search, you can find your show. A lot of times you can click through and you can see it there with even play buttons to listen to individual episodes or go back to your website, et cetera, et cetera. This was the promise of Google Podcasts as well, that podcasts would be searchable and surfaceable in searches for content and for information. It's been slow rolling out, especially if you live outside of the Android ecosystem. But Pod News, James Cridland had some info about what he's seeing right now.
Yeah, so they announced at their big meeting, I guess their version of what Apple does, that, hey, we're rolling this out. We're going to roll out podcast searching. We're going to make audio a legit citizen in terms of search. And sure enough, like it was only like a week after that announcement that all of a sudden play buttons started showing up when you search for something in Google regarding a podcast. Now, there's been all sorts of weird anomalies towards what's happening. So one, the top search result usually ends up being Apple, and it'll bring you to Apple to listen to the podcast, which is odd that Google would be promoting an Apple product. But apparently this is only if you click on the individual episode, it's via Google. So the Google podcast platform. So there's going to be an interesting dynamic there between Google and Apple. In the long run. I think a lot of that has to do with, as we've been talking about, the open podcasting space. If you just have your RSS feed and it's out there in the wild, obviously any search for a podcast, I think Apple is going to come up number one. It's the most relevant platform in regards to podcasting at this particular point, just based on the total number of listens and the total share of podcast listening at this current present day. As things move forward, and Todd mentions a lot of this, they did a much longer and much more technical discussion about this on the New Media Show, and I would highly recommend you listen to what Todd and Rob Greenlee have to say about that. But you ultimately want to drive your audience to your owned and operated place, which is usually your website. If you have your own website, that's where you want your audience to find your podcast, so that you're not necessarily dictating how they listen to your show, but you're controlling their experience a little bit more, and you're owning your audience more than by sending them to Apple or sending them to Google or whatever other listening place that they want to go to. I think all of this will get ironed out as things move forward. Nick Quah in this week's Hot Pod actually makes a point of saying how there have been lots of fits and starts in regards to Google and Spotify and things that they've been doing. And while it may have appeared that like some things that they have done have been failures, they've actually been moments where they were able to sort of learn from what they had done and then make a new evolution. You brought that word up earlier, to evolve what they were doing and improve upon what they were doing as they move forward. So we'll see. This is another positive step for podcasting. Now, if you search for podcasts, you're going to get a play button in that search. Thing is you got to search for a podcast. Like, so if you were to use mine for an example, and I just search, well, actually, mine's probably a bad example, but James brings up a decent example of some like Fun Kids Book Club podcast, which even though they've done everything technically correct, it still doesn't show any play buttons for their particular show. All of these things will work themselves out, but ultimately I think it's a positive step in the long run, and we'll see how it continues to grow. Hopefully, I think the fear is that just because something failed, they're going to take it back. They're going to remove it. I don't think that's the case right now. I think Google is doing things to learn from it, fix it, make it better, and continue to move forward. I believe what Zach is saying from Google, that they want to actually double podcasting audience listening. What does that ultimately mean for Google, though? That is really the bottom line question. And I think that's what the fear is when something like this shows up and it doesn't work right and there's something wrong with it and it fails, quote unquote.
So I think that's the amazing thing for podcasters about Spotify, is that they are so focused on us. It's the reason why we're all excited about Pandora opening up the doors a little bit too, because they're just focused on audio. All of the incentives for those two companies are focused on drawing more listeners to our shows. Their incentives and our incentives are aligned. When we talk about Apple and Google, those companies are both so large, and podcasting, in Apple's case, is literally not a part of their company. It is a service in some ways that they have provided or fostered, et cetera, et cetera. But like you've pointed out so many times, Apple has never made dime one on podcasting. None of the money in their coffers, this massive pile of golden hoard that they have in their Irish mountain or wherever they keep it, it's none of it comes from podcasting. Well, don't they do the double Irish? Isn't that what they call their accounting practices? They run all of their money through Ireland like twice in different ways because it lowers the tax burden. Anyway,
I didn't know that.
Yeah. There's like an office with two people, I think, that is basically processing all of the money for Apple in Ireland somewhere.
By the way, I've watched the show Ozark on Netflix, and now I think everybody's laundering money.
Everyone's laundering money.
Everybody's laundering money at some point.
When you're rich, you don't call it laundering; you call it accounting.
Right, exactly.
So, but none of that money comes from podcasting, and with Google, they at least have a more direct potential to make money from podcasting. And we know that advertising is a large part of Google's business. It's the largest part, probably. So what does that mean, and how do their ideas and incentives align with ours? And that's what makes us nervous, I think, about them. Will Apple abandon us? Will Google abandon this initiative again, as they've abandoned other initiatives on podcasting in the past? I agree with you. I don't think they're going to give this up, particularly because Spotify is treading into some of their grounds. I think Apple's sort of the same way. I think Apple sees Spotify now as a potential real competitor to the music part of their business, which is still not sizable in that it matters actually dollars and cents wise for Apple, but it matters to the impression of the company. It matters to their brand that they be culturally relevant in being a big cornerstone of how people interact with music, I think. And so podcasting now is part of that. And I think that they cannot help but double down in some way on what they've done. Same thing with Google. It's frustrating to us because it's taking so long to roll out. That's what it amounts to. If you look at these inconsistencies that James is talking about on this show, shows up with the play buttons properly in Google. This other show, which has done everything right, and they're in Google Podcasts if you have the app on your Android phone, but they don't show up properly in search. That is today. In 6 months, in 8 months, in a year, whatever it is that Google takes out to roll this out fully, it won't matter, and these will be showing up for everyone. It's just like with the Apple thing. They turned on those podcast pages and then turned them off and then turned them back on like 2 days later, right? Like some of us got them and then they went away and then they came back. They're testing things out. They're trying new initiatives. So don't be... Look, and also... Google, you didn't pay Google anything for any of this. We didn't pay Apple anything for any of this, right? When Libsyn it goes down and you can't access your files because you've paid them, it's fine to get angry at them and send them a support email, right? As Spreaker, I'm a Spreaker host. If something happens with my files on Spreaker, then I'm going to contact support. I'm going to contact Amy Domestico or somebody else with the support team there and be like, "Hey, what are you doing with my show? Let's fix something up." That's not what's going on here. These are two companies that are trying some things around our industry. Don't panic because, like you said, you need to own your domain and then it won't matter what they do long term completely. You can ride the wave one way or the other and keep building up your little pile of folks that come and listen to you every week. See if you can get over that 175 hump.
Nick has some very good questions in this week's Hot Pod in regards to some of the changes happening at Google and Spotify. And just want to, I don't know if we probably don't have the time to dig into them right now, but definitely ask them and think about them. So assuming Spotify and Google indeed accrue meaningful podcast distribution power, should we read their podcast activities as competitive with or additive to the podcast world Apple has fostered? In other words, is this necessarily a zero-sum game? I think that's a very insightful question to give some thought to.
The short one on that, I think if you look at the numbers from this past year, it shows us it's not, right? The growth at Spotify in particular has been almost all new listenership. Will that be true over the course of all time? Probably not. I think there is a cap on how many people want to listen to podcasts, even once the technology is there for everybody. I don't think literally every human being will want to listen to podcasts on a regular basis, but the number is much larger than it is today. And a lot of those folks were introduced to the idea of podcasting or listening to podcasts anyway for the first time this past year through Spotify. I think that will be true for Google as well.
I was talking to a millennial just yesterday who was asking me about what I'm currently doing to make ends meet and asking if this is what I do for a full-time basis. And I was like, just for now. And she asked me what I was previously doing. And I said, well, I used to work for podcasting companies and help podcasters make money, blah, 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 blah. And she's like, oh, that sounds really cool. I've only listened to one podcast my entire life, which I thought was interesting because she is exactly the person that should be listening to a ton of podcasts at this particular point in time. I was like, oh, that's very telling. I do live in Connecticut, though. We're behind the times. Is it possible to sketch a theory of the ecosystem that sees quote unquote big podcasting as separate from quote unquote open podcasting everything else? The latter as perhaps mediated by Apple. Is it possible for the two things to exist in parallel? I think it's definitely, they can exist in parallel. Will Apple be for open podcasting, everything else, and big podcasting be on these other platforms? I don't know. I mean, we've talked about it.
Well, first of all, Overcast has already, Marco's already said he's not going anywhere, and anybody that wants to be there can be there forever. He's going to keep Overcast doors open, and he's going to keep doing his little shortwave radio thing as far as he's concerned. You know, like that's if that's what it is, that's what it is, and that's what I'll be. That's fine. The open podcasting ecosphere. First of all, Apple is never going to shut out independent podcasters from their directory, and we're all already there now, so that's not going away either. What they might do is not do anything else, right? Apple might not ever take the ball any further than they have it right now, and that's what we're sad about, because as these other companies sort of add on and perhaps grow the pie or bring new incentives to the table, it might make Apple's offering less inviting and less integral, less central to the podcast ecosphere than it is currently. I think that's the only potential concern, is like, will the rest of this space get so big and interesting that we don't want to play here anymore? I don't think here will go away.
See, in that, you bring up his next two questions, and the first deals with Apple. How will Apple respond, or should they respond? And if they do respond, how specifically should they respond? So you've already talked about that. And then the last thing he brings up, if Spotify and Google do end up commandeering the bulk of new podcast listenership, what's the move for third-party podcast apps? What new opportunities are they best positioned to pursue? Should they double down on niche communities? Because that is a great question. If you are a third-party app, such as Overcast or even Stitcher, which we brought up not too long ago, or any of these other one-percenters, as Rob Walsh likes to call them, what do you do if Spotify and Google are in this game and they're commandeering, they get a large part of number 2 and number 3 in terms of the podcast listening pie? Is it even worth it for you to continue moving forward as a one percenter?
So one way that they could go, and of course the big companies could do this too, you could effectively create things like Podfund, right? And you could go and poach the best of the middle class and even the hobbyists and say, here's our deal for you. We're going to have some advertising opportunities. We're going to give you free hosting. We're going to provide you all these metrics. We're going to, advertise your show on other shows or across our network, et cetera, and grow your audience a little bit. They could easily do that and with that carve themselves, effectively become record labels, right? Like you could have the top tier, you've got the Warner Brothers and the Universals and et cetera, the top tier people. And then you've got a bunch of little boutique record labels, which would have a small housing, a small, what's the term in wrestling where you have a stable? You got a small stable of artists. I think I could see that as a possibility.
Oh my God,
too.
that's the always listening music.
Well, yeah, no. So okay, but yes, I mean, I think there is a possibility that even folks like me could say, okay, well, what are the economics and how many shows would it take for me to put the thing together to like eke out a little bit of a living and then give all of these people free hosting and allow them to do their podcasting without expenses. Like it might not be a business for everybody involved in those groups, but for some of the folks at the top, they could make a business out of it. And then the bigger companies like Stitcher, for instance, or Overcast. I think Overcast could do a very similar thing. Overcast could partner with networks like Relay.fm, for instance, and sort of combine and make this Voltron that would survive even in the apocalypse where the biggest money sort of runs away into their own silos. So I don't know. I think there's a lot of opportunities there. And the most important thing to know is as long as you keep your domain name,
right,
you don't ever have to worry about this going away. Like you can move your little RSS feed into one of the companies that will help you make it happen for the open ecosphere and continue your show no matter what you want to say. Podcasting's not going anywhere.
Yeah, lots of good things to sit there and think about. One last item of note here before we get into our recommendations of the week, which is essentially a continuation of last week because we forgot to give recommendations and we forgot to talk about Matthew Berry. But new and noteworthy. This has been something I've had on our list for a couple of weeks. We keep pushing it off. And ultimately, I got into a discussion on Facebook about new and noteworthy because it was a decent meme. The meme, I got where the idea was going. It was a picture of people noticing that they were up on the big Jumbotron at a game. And the thought is, everybody looks at the big Jumbotron, they see you and they go, oh, wow, what a cool moment. And then you're gone and then they forget about you. And that was used as a metaphor for new and noteworthy. I want everyone to sort of understand we can't go from one extreme to the other. There's a lot of new people in podcasting that believe that they have to be on new and noteworthy. It's a game changer. If they're not on new and noteworthy, everything is lost. But the opposite is not true. Being on new and noteworthy is still important. It puts you in front of a lot of eyeballs that you aren't going to get otherwise, especially on Apple, for instance. And while the two examples that I have in our show notes are talking about being featured on Apple, and that is the bigger ads that are at the very top of your Apple podcast store, it does show exactly how important it is to get those eyeballs on your podcast. Now, I also have seen this with paid marketing. If you go and you put a bunch of money and you market your show, you're going to get a lot of extra clicks on your podcast and a lot of extra listens to it. If you don't market it again next week and you haven't done the right things in your podcast to get that new listener to subscribe to your show, to come back next week to listen to your show, to continually get that audience member engaged in what you're doing on a weekly basis or however frequent your podcast is, they're not going to come back. So you're going to see a big spike in listens and then it's going to drop off. Now, there's going to be a portion of that audience that will remain anyways, even if you didn't do all that stuff, because they get what you're doing and maybe they're already a podcast listener and they understand the mechanics behind this. Ultimately, what I'm trying to say is new and noteworthy is an opportunity to put yourself in front of a larger audience that can click on your show. That's the importance. It's not going to be something that's going to drive a sizable audience to listen to your podcast unless you have artwork that shows off your podcast in a proper manner, a good title that will entice the person that's never listened to your podcast. It gives them the answer to why. I suggest this to people all the time. Play the why game when you're creating your content. Why am I doing this? And when you answer that, you'll go, well, why should I be doing this? And if you can continue to answer the why, you play the 2-year-old game, you're going to create great content. Why would I title my podcast this way? Because I want somebody who's never listened to it to continue listening. What words do I need to do that? What words are going to entice a new listener to click play on the show? They have no idea what it is. But the name of my show is called Next Fan Up. Why would I want to listen? We're talking about the NFL draft. Okay, that's part of it. Why else might I want to listen? The Arizona Cardinals had the worst draft ever. That's got to be somewhere in the show notes, probably in the top, because it's going to be too much to put in. All of these things will continue to lead you to market your show the proper way, as long as you keep asking yourself why. And that's what New and Noteworthy gives you, an opportunity to be in front of more people than if you weren't in New and Noteworthy. So it's important. It's just not as important as you think it is. And it's not as unimportant as a lot of podcasters these days seem to be, oh, you don't have to be a New and Noteworthy. You don't have to be a New and Noteworthy. You don't have to be a New and Noteworthy, but it's still a very good place to help jumpstart your marketing for your show.
First of all, before we actually started recording today, Jay, you and I were talking about jobs and knowing people and like having someone speak for you or recommend you or having an in and a company, et cetera, et cetera. That is not the only way to get your foot in the door, not the only way to get started, but it is in many people's stories the shortcut to success that they found by having a friend, by having someone they knew from their past, by having a family member, et cetera, in the right place. But if you haven't done the preparation, if you don't have the high quality product to show for it, et cetera, I think about musicians who seem like overnight successes, but they wrote that first album for 10 years on the road. They worked in honky tonks and bars and little no-name places, rewriting those songs and culling down their list again and again and again, so that the first 10 you ever hear from them were all gems. But that's because they had been polished in the diamond mines, my friend. Then they got to turn around in 6 months and write the next one, right?
And the second album's always horrible.
Yeah, well, but that's why. And so yes, New and Noteworthy is, if you're a restaurant, it's like having your billboard on the interstate, right? That's a great thing for you. But if your restaurant stinks, if the food's bad, if the restaurants are dirty, if the restrooms are dirty, then that billboard won't matter, because very quickly people will know to pass it up. Likewise, Jay, you said the artwork, you got to have the right artwork. If your logo is crappy, if it's like a zebra taking a poop, nobody's going to get off the interstate to go to your restaurant. You know what I mean?
Actually, I think that would drive quite a number of clicks. If your artwork is your face and nobody knows who the hell you are.
Unless you're Paul Rudd, nobody cares to see your face on the thing. If you're a celebrity, then by all means, put your name in the title or put your mug on the image. But if you're not a celebrity, unless the point of your podcast is to become a known figure, if the whole point is to brand yourself, then maybe.
I would say no, not even in that regard. Certainly not until you have a sizable audience, sizable enough that it means your face should be on the artwork. Your face should never be on the artwork. Never, ever. Unless you're a celebrity and that's your brand. Then do it. Yes, because you're going to drive more. Oh, I know who that person is. I'm going to click on that and listen to what they have to say. Oh my God, they sit and talk about zebras taking poops in the desert. I have no desire to listen to this podcast anymore.
I don't. You know what I had in my head? I had the Squatty Potty ad in my head. It's a unicorn though, right? Not a zebra. I was so close. Yeah. So close and not far away.
I'd be even more. See, if I saw a unicorn squatting on a potty in artwork, I think that could get the job done.
Well, it worked. It worked for that. That ad agency sells like a course on how to build advertising now, and they use that as one of the examples of like, here's one of the things that we did and people love is this pooping unicorn. That poops rainbow yogurt or whatever.
I'm all in.
Jay, let's
make
tell
that
everybody
artwork happen tomorrow.
Let's tell everybody what we're listening to currently. You referenced it. We're going to continue with the theme from last week. We've both been listening to some Marvel stuff. I actually, this morning, was wrapping up this episode. My pick for this week is Smodcast episode 414. Smodcast, of course, a long-running show. Kevin Smith and Scott Mosier are the primary hosts, although this episode actually is Kevin Smith and his co-host from Fat Man Beyond, Mark Bernardin, who is a writer and a comic writer and a film writer in his own right. The two of them are visited by Marcus and McFeely, the two writers behind Avengers Endgame as well as Infinity War. They also wrote Civil War. They also wrote Captain America Winter Soldier and Captain America the First Avenger. I think they had a hand in writing Thor the Dark World as well. It was really interesting hearing their start, by the way. Their big break, and they made a bunch of crappy stuff too, but their first actual break into Hollywood was the film The Life and Death of Peter Sellers. And then from there, they went directly into the Narnia series. And from the Narnia series, they did a couple that were sort of stumbles, actually. They didn't have a big success in the Narnia series, but they ended up getting fired from Narnia and ended up taking on Captain America, the First Avenger. And by the way, it took them 6 months to get approval from Marvel for their pitch. Like, they went in the first time and kept going back in again to meet with them again. It was like 6 or 7 months before they finally got the go-ahead to begin writing that script. So anyway, a wonderful story if you're a writer or a creator, but also if you're into the Marvel movies at all. It's cool to see behind the scenes from the two of them in that episode. Smodcast 414, Marcus and McFeely Make Mine Marvel.
We mentioned Matthew Berry had a cameo in Avengers Endgame, and then we never talked about it.
Yes.
When we did. What did we do? Like an hour of we did a separate
like 30 to 40
podcast
minutes.
at the
A
end
whole
of our
podcast.
Yeah, at the end of our podcast business podcast. We did a pop culture podcast. It was fantastic. Go back and listen to it. I highly recommend it. But we failed.
Let's tell them.
Berry.
So the slight spoiler: there is a scene where I'm trying to think of how to say it without spoiling it completely. There is a scene in which Tony Stark and Thor are involved with a guard from S.H.I.E.L.D., and Thor ends up restarting Tony's heart with the hammer. And the guard that is speaking to them was actually Matthew Berry.
Right. Matthew Berry, the co-host of the Fantasy Focus football podcast, the 06010 at ESPN. He also now has a very successful paid-for internet show with his new producer, the Secret Squirrel, Daniel Dopp, whom I taught everything. He knows everything Daniel Dopp knows is thanks to me. And he's welcome for having the career that he now has for me leaving, because that clearly would have been my spot. Not bitter or anything. No, not at all. This has always happened to me. I always leave at the wrong time. But in any case,
we joked, Jay, last week that the Russos must be big fantasy. No, I joked that Chris Hemsworth was a big fantasy fan, but it was actually the Russos. Matthew Berry is friends with the Russos.
Yeah, and they are big into fantasy football, and they offered him the spot. And I joked that it must have been for a spot in the Man's League, because we did things like that. We said, hey, you put us in your video game and you'll be in the Man's League. Or there was an animator who actually got into a little bit of trouble because myself, Matthew Berry, and Nate Ravitz are all characters in Brave, the Pixar movie Brave. You can tell who Matthew Berry is rather easily. Nate's a little more difficult to pick out, and I'm a little more difficult to pick out, mainly because who the heck knows who the hell Jay Soderbergh Pod Vader is and what he looks like. But all three of us are in Brave, which was pretty cool. We're not, our voices obviously aren't in it, but
right.
our likenesses were used in that movie, and the animator almost got into a whole heck of a lot of trouble for it.
That's amazing. In
any case, all of those things were done in exchange for a spot in the Man's League. So the fact that Matthew Berry is now it makes a cameo in Avengers Endgame. I'm wondering if John Russo, I think it was John Russo, now has like a lifetime membership to the Man's League. I wonder if actually he's taking my spot in the men's league since I'm no longer an ESPN. They need someone else for everyone to compete against. I wonder if that'll be Mr. Russo.
So the thing that gets me though is, and I mean, I knew this obviously, but I hadn't thought about it. I was reading the article, and it's linked in last week's show notes, by the way, about Matthew's cameo. He talks, I can't remember what publication he talked to about it, but one of the geek publications had an article about it. The thing that was interesting to me is, the Infinity War and Avengers Endgame were filmed simultaneously. They were filmed back to back, all in one go. And that was like 3 years ago now, almost, when they were filmed. And Matthew had to be quiet about it this entire time. And like, even he didn't know exactly how it would fit into the story, but he said in the article, like 6 people at ESPN, like his bosses, a bunch of the executives basically knew what he was doing because he had to be gone from work for a couple of days. And other than that, nobody knew what had happened. But every now and again, one of them would go like, was this the one you're in? Like, a new movie would come out and they'd be like, is this the one you're going to be in? I don't know. And he's like, no, shh, not yet. That would be amazing to me, to be able to do something like that and then have to keep it quiet for that long. Like, he didn't tell his wife that he was standing next to Tony Stark, for instance. Like, that's crazy. Kelly would kill me.
So anyway, I suggest the Marvel Cinematic Universe. They've been doing the podcast for years. And especially if you're looking for that water cooler talk, they do a great job of, they've done multiple podcasts like this where they'll do their own reaction to the movie. And then they'll do maybe a week later a feedback. So they'll gather all the feedback from their audience and share their reactions to the movie. And for this particular one, they mentioned they'll probably do like 3 or 4 feedback episodes because they've had so much reaction from their audience to the movie. So if you like that water cooler type talk, you're going to hear people talking about things that maybe you haven't heard anyone else talk about, because I mean, you're going to hear more ideas from more people. So the more people that are reacting, you're going to hear something that you didn't hear before, or you're going to hear something that no one else has said yet that you had the same reaction to, and now you have a connection, and that's how you build engagement, ladies and gentlemen. So a great job there by the guys of the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
On a completely unrelated note, but I just saw the headline cross my desk, Jay. Disney has now announced that they are going to take full control of Hulu. They have made a deal with Comcast to buy out Comcast, NBC, Universal. Disney is going to buy out the rest of that. So Comcast owned about 33% of the company, and over the course of the next few years, they will be closed out. Disney will control it entirely. We knew that this was probably the way that was going to go in the end, but now it's confirmed. So Disney will have 2 entertainment streaming services, and then the ESPN Plus play as a sports play on top of that too. Interesting times as the media world continues to shift. All right, Jay, tell everybody where they can follow you on Twitter and keep up with you and your work.
I am at The Real Podvader on Twitter, facebook.com/Podvader page. You can hire me and do so quickly before Disney comes and shuts me down.
That's right. Folks, I am online at propodcastingservices.com. You can find my podcasts and all of my work there. You can find me on Twitter at The Rogues Life. And until next week, we've been your hosts. I'm Joel.
I'm Jay, still alive.
And we are always listening.
Yeah, I know I ain't seen it all, but I've seen enough.
Always Listening is a proud member of the Two Guys and a Rogue network. You can find all of our past episodes, including more than 100 podcast reviews, at alwayslisteningpod.com, in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher Radio, or anywhere you listen to podcasts. For help on your podcast, visit propodcastingservices.com. Our theme song is Enough from Bethany Rayburn.
When that day comes and I stop breathing, will you bury me with my love? Will you bury me with my love? 'Cause if I never thought twice about dying, then there's this ain't no life at all. Honey, it ain't no life at all. Yeah, I know I ain't seen it all, but I've seen enough. Yeah, I know I ain't seen it all, but I've seen enough. Yeah, I know I ain't seen it all, but I've seen enough. Yeah, I know I ain't seen it all, but I've had enough.
Two guys and a rogue.
I'm one guy,
I'm the other.
and this is the network.